My name is Michael McGrath, better known on the internet by the dubious moniker Muff Wiggler, and we're here in Ottawa. So I've been into computers and technology since I was a kid, and strangely enough, I've been playing drums since I was about 9 years old. And I guess I first became familiar with these things when I was probably about 12 or 13, and I saw the Pink Floyd Live at Pompeii film. And there's a scene probably many people are familiar with where Roger Waters is playing with an EMS Synthy in Abbey Road Studios, just sort of twisting the knob and listening to the resonance go up. And I was absolutely taken by the thing. Partially sort of being impressed by the fact that this is the sort of thing that will always be outside the reach of someone like myself, not being a keyboard player, not being, a studio musician. These amazing synthesizers seem so far off, but so interesting. And then sort of years later, we have this kind of new revolution in some of the analog stuff that's coming out these days. And, a couple decades later, I was in a different stage of my life, and it seemed affordable and interesting. And so suddenly this, dream of my youth returned in sort of my adulthood. Look at all the knobs. That it pretty much comes down to that. Actually, I did spend a couple of years working with software synthesizers before I got into hardware, mostly to wrap my head around these ideas, that I'd seen back in that Pink Floyd movie, VCF and VCA, and all these acronyms, and I didn't even know what they meant. And I was certainly not going to run out and spend hundreds of dollars, something I didn't understand. Software let me realize that I could understand and use these things. But software also sort of frustrated me trying to turn knobs with my mouse, and just got pretty annoying troubleshooting drivers, and I really longed for something I could just hit a power button and put my hand on a knob and start turning it. And I think compared to digital and some of the sort of self-contained synthesizers, this one's really nice because I'm not a keyboard player. I'm not sort of a traditional musician, and I think for some of us using modulars, it's a way that we can sort of break the rules and use these synthesizers without necessarily feeling that we have to have these incredible keyboard chops that some of the players have. So it lets us off the hook a little bit. We can hide behind our knobs and wires. There's modules that do things in digital you can't do in analog. There's analog modules that come up with sounds you'll never get out of digital. I think to each their own. I think ideally you have a really nice blend where both sides kind of contribute the best they can to the puzzle. Give you as many options as you can. This feeling we all have, if only I had that great stuff, look at the great music I would produce. And 99% of the time that's absolutely false. And there's that whole gear, that gear lust train again. If I just had this new module, my music would be perfect. Now I just need this one. Now I just need that one. And I think maybe part of it is making excuses for our own lack of output sometimes. But I think there's a number of jealousy factors out there. It doesn't bother me at all. I mean, you look at the same thing with vintage guitars. I mean, there's these $50,000 guitars now, from the 50s and 60s, these old Fenders. They say 3/4 of them are in Japan being held on to by some collector. Doesn't matter to me. These things are objects. People buy them for different reasons. Some people like to frame them and look at them, and that makes them feel good, and they get inspired somehow in their life by that. Some people like to play with them. Some people produce incredible records that we all go out and buy and blast in our cars and feel great listening to. I personally can't judge it because we all come from a different angle, and there's different reasons we're involved. It's an interesting story, actually. I didn't originally intend to ever have a modular synth forum. I was looking for some online hosting about 5 years ago just to upload some of my own sort of crummy tracks for friends to listen to. There was nothing like Bandcamp at the time. I wound up getting a great deal on hosting, so I set up the domain with the goofy name Muffwiggler.com just because that was my forum handle on some other forums. Started by uploading some music, and then, being a bit of an IT geek, I started playing around with my hosting package. It had PHP and MySQL. So just for fun, I installed the forum code just to look under the hood, see the admin console that, was being used by these other forums I participated on. And out of the blue, people started just signing up. I think Brian, Zero Sum, and Eric from Metasonics were some of the very first people to sign up at the forum. My friend Ross from Chicago, I think, was the next one. And I thought, well, gee, if these people are here, let's sort of cater to them. And they like talking about modulars, so we created a couple of modular sub-forums. And it was kind of one of these classic scenes of if you build it, they will come. And all of a sudden, more and more people started, showing up. And it's absolutely bizarre because I never really intended to have this there in the first place. I did quickly try and set it up to cater towards that community though, because I was starting to experiment with these synthesizers and I found a huge lack of information. The information I could get was from a variety of mailing lists. You know, there's a couple of people, a gentleman named Chris McDonald from Canada, saw me on the Blasset mailing list and he sent me a private email and started sending me some various tips. But you know, unless you went to CalArts or one of these schools, the information was really sort of hidden away behind mailing lists. A lot of them where people were too intimidated to ask questions because there's some very senior or some very intelligent people maybe who participated on these lists. So I thought it would be nice if there was a really laid back place where sort of, you know, no ego, no sort of hero worship. People could just sort of kick back, wouldn't be afraid to say, hey, I'm new at this. I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I need some help. And it just spiraled from there. It's amazing to me to see how big it's gotten. You know, one of the interesting discussions is you really, you know, what is music? I have probably, if you look on my Bandcamp site, you know, in years of doing this, I've probably finished maybe 6 or 7 tracks that I think are complete and this is done as a piece of music. Uh, you know, I think we're all in this for very different reasons. I like sort of exploring sounds, and the odd time I find one I really like, I'll hit record. 9 times out of 10, I don't. It's more sort of about the process, and this is honestly my break from, you know, raising 3 kids, doing, you know, a corporate job all day long that I'm blessed to really enjoy, but that's not necessarily where my heart always is, and I sort of need an outlet. So, you know, I do think everyone with these systems, and I see it on the forum, they're all using them. They're just using them in very different ways. And some people say, you know, you have $40,000 worth of equipment, but, you know, where's your album? Where's your song? And I don't, you know, I think it's fair to ask that question, but I think it's equally fair to come back and say, you know what, that's not what I'm using this stuff for. My song isn't there. You know, my song is between me and the instrument in those moments in the middle of the night, you know, when I'm finding inspiration and having fun alone with this instrument. And I didn't hit record because it's, you know, it's very temporal. It's in a time and place. And a lot of the things I find satisfying on these instruments, if I record them and listen to them a day later, you know, the magic isn't there. It's all about sort of the interaction. And that's what is special about these. When, you know, you mentioned the digital systems before, you can't press save. What I love about these synthesizers is every sound you make, it really is for that place and time only, and you have to take it apart afterwards. And even if you try and record it, you lose the interaction you get from the knobs. And so that special thing you've created disappears the minute you try and save it. It's all very fleeting, and I enjoy that quite a bit. A lot of the precious things in life are fleeting. And, you know, it forces you to smell the roses when you're standing in front of them rather than try and take a picture and save it for later. There's, and I can think of about a half dozen women who are on the forum and participate. And what I think is interesting is when we look back sort of at the history of, at least kind of the academic side of electronic music, there's quite a lot of women who've been involved. Suzanne Ciani, you know, Delia Derbyshire, there's quite a number of them who've been massively influential sort of over the history of this experimental, kind of starting with tape music, moving into sort of modular synthesizers. And I think really it's just a law of numbers. I mean, you could say, why aren't there a lot of women guitar players? Well, if you go out, you know, you'll find there's actually quite a lot of them out there. They're just overshadowed by these legions and legions of young men, you know, on the forums out there. The other thing I think is the men tend to talk about it more. You know, we're more likely to go out and post on the forum, whereas, you know, the couple of women I know who do have modulars, they spend their time using them rather than on the internet talking about them. So they're a little bit more wise and productive how they spend their time. My wife would agree with that statement. A good friend of mine on the forum, I just found out recently, he and his wife are splitting up. I'm pretty grateful to my wife and my kids for sort of supporting, or at least dealing with, you know, my habit and taking over about half the basement here. But certainly, you know, I think when you look at the cost, the amount of time, the amount of space these things take up in our homes, and the fact that in many cases my wife just doesn't get it. My kids do, but she comes down here and just says, you know, she's tried twisting the knobs and listening to sounds. She's just said, I don't see why this is such an obsession for so many people. So yeah, I hope it doesn't break up marriages, but you know, there's worse things we could be spending our time doing. I suspect there's a lot of people using these synthesizers as somewhat retail therapy, whether they're hiding from some problem, you know, in their own life, or if it's you know, mask or something else. I think it's certainly a lot more constructive habit than, you know, some of the destructive things people can do when they have these issues. But you're absolutely right. I mean, somebody once said that you know, these Eurorack modules are like Pokemon. We got to catch them all. I think hype plays into it a lot. You know, this is maybe one of the downsides to the forum. there seems to be this cycle. A new module gets announced, a whole bunch of people get excited, they hype it up, everybody sort of runs out and buys it without even really thinking, what does it do? Does it fit into my workflow? And then a month later, the hype's gone, and a third of the people who bought them are flipping them in the used modules for them. So there's a little bit of a flavor of the month and a hype aspect that plays in. Certainly for me, with the Eurorack, I came to sort of feel that the synthesizer is never going to be done, and I'm focusing all my energy and time on planning the next module, planning the placement in the rack, shuffling other modules around to make room for it. No, I don't have enough power, getting another power supply. And I have limited amount of time to spend actually using these instruments. After a few years of that, I got really tired of all of my energy going into planning a system, and I really wanted to spend my time using the system. I do personally feel that music requires limitations. If we have a complete blank slate, it's impossible to get anything done. And for me, a never-ending rack represents way too much temptation to buy and configure rather than to actually sit and work. So I decided, I'm limiting myself to X amount of space, X amount of modules. If I can't do something satisfying to me with that configuration, the problem isn't the gear, the problem is somewhere with me. So those limitations help me be a lot more productive. For some people, it's go, 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 build, build, build. And I'll be honest, I look at some of these wall of synths, and that's when I sort of feel this temptation. I think, wow, would it ever be cool to have a 9-foot tall, never-ending rack? Does that ever look sexy? But I guess it's a means to an end. And if sexiness is the end you're going for, okay, build a giant wall. And if not, find what works for you in your workflow, build that system. And then, just the modules on this table here, I'll spend 20 years exploring these and I'll only scratch the surface. There's so much potential here. I don't really feel the need to sort of keep going on this endless gear train, which is sort of hypocritical because I've spent 5 years on that gear train to sort of figure out where I need to be. But it feels good to know finally what I want to do.